morning, everybody. Nice to be back here. Nice to see you all out in the audience. 400 of my closest friends. I hope you all got a cup of coffee today. This is why we're here after all. This is the joy of this thing. I've gotten to speak up here, I don't know, probably 6 or 7 of these Symposium activities, RICO activities. And the last couple of years, they've been sort of talking about market consolidation, a few other things. But before that, I was doing a lot of these, what I call dire warning speeches about all the terrible things that are threatening the coffee world. And somebody told me last year that they missed my dire warning session, and I thought, what kind of masochist misses this set of bad news? But, you know, I got to play to the audience, so I'm here to deliver some dire warnings this year. There are definitely storm clouds on the horizon. And I say that with a smile on my face because I'm supposed to be somewhat entertaining here, but I also am a believer in this. And everything I'm about to present to you is stuff that you have probably heard elsewhere, and it's certainly things that I have said before. But I will say that I gave a presentation 4 years ago, and I looked at some of the what I perceived as the existential threats facing coffee, and everybody nodded, and then we all left the room, and then we all went back to doing whatever it is we were doing in the days before that speech. And about a month and a half ago, I happened to be in a room full of really smart coffee people, which is gratifying, except for you realize that there's lots of people way smarter than you out in the world. But it was great to be in that room, and one of those really smart coffee people said something to me that was basically a complete reflection of this presentation that I'd given 4 years ago. So I thought, maybe I ought to just revisit some of this stuff. So we're going to see some of this. So here are some of the things threatening coffee. This doesn't look like a threat to coffee. It looks like a real estate ad. But one of the things that's challenging coffee, and particularly specialty coffee, is land use pressure. There's a limited amount of land out there and an ever-increasing number of people with ever-increasing access to wealth. And one of the things they like to do with that wealth is acquire land and put houses on it. This particular ad is for what used to be part of a coffee farm in Alajuela, Costa Rica. Lovely little house. You'll note that friendliness prevails, amicable locals, natural beauty, and coffee, ironically, is part of the ornamental attraction of this house. But Alajuela, as you know, is a prime coffee-producing region, and Costa Rica, as you know, has lost a tremendous amount of exceptional coffee-producing territory to condominiums and apartments and houses and other things. And there's lots of other land use pressures, not just for residential construction, but other farm crops, staple food crops. Lots of things have started to pressurize land use, and coffee has suffered for it. Another problem that we face that's endemic for us in the coffee industry is an aging farmer population. In Colombia, the average farmer's age is pushing 60 now. In Kenya, coffee is described as an old man's hobby. And we've got a real issue here. This is a critical issue facing us. As this population ages, they're not being replaced by a younger generation for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is that life as a coffee farmer has not been the most attractive possible life to look at. We've also got this global warming thing. You guys may have heard about it if you're from outside of the U.S. It's not actually happening in the U.S. But it's having real impacts, and some of those impacts are a lot more severe weather activity happening around the world, and it's compounded by all the opportunistic pathogens out there, by all the unusual activities out there, by a real paucity of good responses from humans in general about what to do about this significant changes in our climate. And this is a slide. It's a shameless promotion for World Coffee Research built into this, but it's really clipped out of one of the reasons that World Coffee Research emerged, is to sort of assess what the effects of global warming are, what the new threats are, and how we adapt or mitigate or otherwise prepare for those things. And those threats are still, regardless of the current rhetoric here, those threats are clear and present. The backdrop of this, of course, is this coffee world that we live in. And the good news is that coffee consumption has been increasing at a fabulous rate. So this slide baselined in 2012, and it looked at growth in coffee consumption in 3 possible scenarios. On the low end at about a 1.5% annual growth worldwide, and at the high end, 2.5%. And I'm happy to say that the trend line has actually been on the very high end of this, on the 2.5% side. Global coffee consumption has been growing, which is good for us, people who buy and sell coffee. We have lots of business out there, and that's a very positive thing. This is, and sorry about all the graphs. I know I'm not supposed to give you guys graphs because they're hard to see, so I'll just try to talk through them, and hopefully they're not horrible for you. But what you really see here is that global coffee consumption and production have been roughly in balance over the last 15 years here. There's some ups and downs. We are in a 3-year trend of a little bit of a deficit, so flat to deficit production. And it looks like stocks are pretty well taken out of the market. We never really know how much coffee Brazilian farmers have put aside for that rainy day or for better prices or for the right foreign exchange scenario. But it looks like we've tapped out most of the stocks in producers' hands, and stocks in the consuming side are not building. I mean, they've stayed fairly level. They were in extraordinarily low condition in 2010, 11, 12, and they've built back up, but they're not enormous by any stretch of the imagination. So we've got this backdrop of increasing consumption worldwide and a very sort of in parity, slightly deficit production-consumption balance. This is a recipe for volatility, no doubt. This is the thing that I really wanted to point your attention to, though. And this is the piece that emerged, and I said, gosh, I know I just talked about this, and I want to talk to you about it again. This is the trend. We talked a lot about consolidation on the consuming side of the market because we can't help but talk about that. But take a look at these numbers. In 1996, the top 5 producers of all coffee worldwide produced 57% of the somewhere around 100 million bags that were produced then. Today, and this in 2012, we were predicting this, but today, at even a more accelerated rate, nearly 75% of the world's coffee comes from just 5 countries around the world. And if it stays on that trend line, by 2030, we'll have more than 80% of the world's coffee coming from 5 producing countries. That is a dramatic consolidation. There's also this. We've grown our production worldwide to stay in balance with our consumption needs, with our demand, from about 110 million bags around the beginning of the new millennium to 150 million bags today. But 90% of that 40 million bags has come from just 2 countries, either from Brazil or Vietnam. Just 2 countries have delivered that to us. So we have needed to find 40 million bags, and 36 million of them have come from 2 places. That's food for thought as we think about this potential volatility in the supply and demand equation, and a growth curve that suggests we're going to need something like 180 million bags of coffee in just 15 or 20 years. Where will that come from? Here's something else. We're here in Seattle for the Specialty Coffee Expo. I want to point you to this. Washed Arabica, if you think of washed Arabica as a proxy for specialty coffee, and by the way, all you people who love these fancy naturals out there, I'm not bagging on naturals. I like naturals too. I like fancy naturals a lot. But when we think about the specialty coffee world that we've occupied for the last 30 years, most of that's been built on a basis of washed Arabica coffees. And look at this trend line. For the last nearly 30 years, washed Arabica production, other miles, Colombians and other miles, has been relatively stable at just under 40 million bags. Meanwhile, we've grown our total production from 85 million bags to 150 million bags. And almost all of that new production, really all of that new production, has come in Robustas and in natural Arabicas, which has some implications for markets in the future. If we just extend this, if we just look at the trend lines, this is what things look like by 2030. And this, by the way, is without the impact of global warming, without the impact of things like rust, without the impact of land use pressure, labor pressure, et cetera, in Mesoamerica in particular, where so much of our washed Arabica comes from. This is the trend line So if you're in the specialty coffee business, either you're shifting your ideas about specialty coffee or you're competing for an ever diminishing share of a growing pie, right? That washed Arabica somewhere around 20% by 2030, and again, with no externalities figured in, just the current trend line. One could make a very reasonable case that washed Arabica would represent 10% or so of total coffee production by 2030 or 2035, if there are any significant external impacts, which it seems likely there will be. This is just a little cut of production trends for some countries that are famous for their washed Arabicas. And if you look at this, this is relatively grim, and you can add in places like Kenya, where production since 1990 is down by about 40%. You've got Costa Rica's had some ups and downs, but overall also down by about 40%. Mexico down by about 50%. Guatemala down by 35%. Costa Rica down by 40%. Salvador down by 65%. India's had some ups and downs, but these are washed Arabica producers whose total production has diminished. So we're just barely keeping up at this 40 million bag level of washed Arabica in the face of a market that wants to grow with specialty. So you look at me and you go, Rick, so this is all terrifying, but really, why do I care? I want to talk to you a little bit about why we should care about this. First, there's the obvious one, the business threat. Anybody who has done their Harvard B School backup reading know about Porter's 5 forces analysis. And if you look at the one on the right-hand side, that's us. We've had lots of bargaining power as buyers for a long, long time. But if you look on the other side, you've got the bargaining power of suppliers. And think about this for a minute. 5 countries producing more than 80% of the world's supply of coffee. And those 5 countries are, the top 3 are Brazil, Vietnam, and Colombia. And you're talking about 3 countries that are well-resourced, that have sophisticated farmers, and 2 of those, Brazil and Vietnam, have the luxury of having a coffee crop that they can lay aside, that they can hold in reserve for some time, for as long, really, as their own economic power holds out to keep those out of the marketplace. So as a buyer of coffee, how do you feel about a reversal in fortunes where instead of the buyers holding all the cards, with sellers literally standing by the side of the road waiting for a buyer to come by, imagine reversing that, where you as a buyer are trying desperately to find somebody who wants to sell you coffee and not having any success. That's a possible future, not even an unlikely future. Here's another reason to care. As coffee people, we have said quite blithely for the last 20 years, looking at this growth in consumption, we said, listen, if there's demand, Brazil will just grow more coffee. And it seems fairly true. We've seen this trend over time. We need more coffee, Brazil makes more coffee. As long as the price is right and Brazil can make money at coffee, they'll make more coffee. And Vietnam has come in and said, hey, we also can make more coffee. Nobody worry about a thing. If you need coffee, we'll just grow it for you. But I want you to take a look at these growth curves. What is meaningful here are the red line and the white line across there. And it's not as profound in a line as it is in reality. What we've seen here is a leveling off of the capacity for growth in both Brazil and Vietnam. And if you consider not just the data, but start to look at some of the patterns here, one of the things you'll notice is that Brazil has started to move out of its classic biennial crop differential, largely because Brazilian farmers have gotten more sophisticated and have started to manage their pruning, irrigation, and other activities to take advantage of a more constant supply of coffee and not be subject to these massive swings in coffee production. But we've also seen this year the impact of drought, of record high temperatures, and other persistence problems, particularly in Espírito Santo, and we've seen what can happen to the Robusta production there. We're shy 3 million bags, 4 million bags of Robusta in Brazil, and the domestic market needs that coffee. I mean, imagine this, an actual serious conversation in Brazil about importing coffee into Brazil. I don't think that's likely to happen, but I've been wrong about stranger things, presidential election, and it's possible. We could see actual imports of coffee into Brazil. And Vietnam has got a population not only of aging farmers, but a population of aging trees. You've got a lot of 30-year-old Robusta plants there, and production is starting to decline. And you look at that in the backdrop of increasing challenges to get water. Things like salinity in the water table in Vietnam are having impacts. And competition from other cash crops. Pepper starts to look pretty good right now, so maybe coffee's not going to reign supreme there. So the possibility exists that we can't just turn to Vietnam and Brazil and say, hey, we need another 40 million bags. Could you grow that, please? I want you to look at this slide one more time. This is the slide that means the most to me, not just because I like the colors, but because we're really talking about washed Arabica being the most threatened coffee out there. And I have had the luxury of spending my entire coffee career in specialty coffee, and washed Arabica has been the feature of specialty coffee for that entire 30 years. Imagine this future where there's very little washed Arabica out there. Not only is it challenging to compete for that supply, but I will tell you that coffee in the mature markets in the US, in Europe, and Japan declined in per capita consumption for many years and recovered on the backs of our little niche industry, our little specialty industry, returned coffee to prominence in the mature markets, in the markets that consume most of the world's coffee by the cup. And in the US, the NCA's National Coffee Drinking Trends Survey just had a data point in it that I was astounded by. Self-reported coffee drinkers, yesterday's coffee drinkers, identified 57% of the cups that they drank as gourmet or specialty coffee. That's a nice little niche, huh? But it's based on this. It's based on washed Arabica coffee. These people, the new entrants to coffee, are people in pursuit of these specialty coffees, of these washed Arabica coffees, and our supplies to fill that need are threatened. So what do we do? What do we do? Well, I think there's 3 areas we need to look at. We need a global strategy for how to react to this, and that means we need to do research, activities like World Coffee Research that look at the next generation of genetic material, that look at how we respond to climate change, that look at how we adapt or mitigate those impacts. Those are a necessary thing for us. We need coffee supply research, and we've got to fund it as an industry because nobody else will. There is no donor out there that's just thinking, hey, I ought to throw some money at coffee. We need to do this as an industry. We have to be focused on climate adaptation. Deny all you want, but our climate is changing, and we've got to be prepared for it. I'm not sure that we can mitigate at this point, but we have to adapt. So we've got to be focused on this. And then, as we all know, finance is the key. Access to financial tools, to risk management tools, to investment capital, to all the things that farmers need to have to keep producing. Access to finance is critical, and we need a global strategy to make sure that we provide access to finance. There's producer-focused strategies that we have to be aware of. And I look at successful producing countries, successful producing economies, and this is what it distills down to for me. Countries that have a strong domestic consumption are much better prepared to weather the volatility of the coffee market and volatility in foreign exchange markets. Coffee is a dollar-denominated commodity, and it has huge twists and turns that are impacted by whatever the local currency is. Successful farmers need to have destination markets. Farmers can't keep growing coffee and hoping someone will buy it. Farmers have to identify the buyer of their coffee and grow the coffee for that buyer. And in the most successful coffee economies and the most successful coffee farmers, we know that they have those destination markets in mind. And then institutional partners. Say what you will about institutions. We love to hate institutions. But having a strong coffee institution in a coffee-producing economy is critical for success. Somebody who can have the macro outlook, somebody who can advise policymakers, somebody who can react to the benefit of the entire coffee sector and not just to the benefit of one farmer or one exporter or one roaster. Having that institution is a critical piece. And places where there's a strong institutional partner, we have strong chances for success. On the consumer side, we need a strategy too. You're going to hear more about this today, but we need a regulatory environment that works, that makes sense, that is not just the whim of folks who operate at these sort of government levels. We need more research. We need solid research about market dynamics, about what's attractive, what the future trends are, where demographics are taking us, why consumers interact with coffee the way they do. We know that consumers have a dramatic emotional connection to coffee, but we need to know why and what the limits of that are and how we best deliver products that are satisfying to that emotional context. We need consumer insights around coffee and coffee quality to keep moving forward with specialty coffee. What are we talking about? What's the call to action here? What we're really talking about is collaboration. How do we find a way to apply these global strategies, to help develop the producer strategies, to work in partnership with them as we look at our consumer strategies? And this is why we're here. This is why we're in this room. This is why we're in this city. This is why we're in this organization, the Specialty Coffee Association, because we recognize this need for collaboration. And it's being answered in ways large and small all around the world. But our job, your job as leaders in this industry, is to identify those modes, those possibilities for collaboration, to develop and apply those strategies so that we can keep coming back here, having a great cup of coffee, an important conversation, and exerting our leadership in the world. That's why I'm here. That's why the Specialty Coffee Association exists. And this is both my invitation to you and my call to action to you. Get involved. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being members. I invite you to be leaders in this community. Thank you.